It is Saturday, August 15th, and welcome to another edition of the Armstrong Weaver Show. One of my favorite guests, Patricia ONWUKA, is joining us solo in our kickoff segment. Patricia, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Armstrong. Good to see you.
My pleasure. You know, Americans increasingly, Ms. ONWUKA, distrust the news media. Did the public abandon journalism, or did journalism first abandon the public?
I would say journalism abandoned the public. When we look at how the political sway is of journalists today, and that's been true for quite some time, but what's been more recent is the activist journalists who underscore activists, meaning they push an agenda more than they're willing to go push the facts and let people decide, readers decide what's the truth. And I think certainly during 2020 and the COVID episode certainly opened many people's eyes to, how the media was, complicit in, I won't say covering up, but certainly not being, inquisitive, not asking questions, but taking from whatever government entities every and any piece of information that they said about COVID, about vaccines, about cures or treatments to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we expected journalists to actually provide some pushback when in certain parts of the conservative right news and blog sphere and even podcast sphere, it was there was a lot more information that was coming out, but it never made it into the mainstream. Let me stop you there because you're saying something. So I guess my follow-up with what you're saying is, when did journalists begin confusing reporting with advocacy, and has that damaged our credibility? Prior to 2020, I think it's been simmering for quite some time, but 2020 was not only about COVID, it was also about Black Lives Matter. And you had those two massive episodes happening right at the same time as a presidential election. And suddenly we began to understand that the journalists cared more about the narrative that they were crafting. You and I can remember when CNN reporters were in front of burning neighborhoods, police cars on fire, and saying these protests are not riots, they're generally peaceful. Well, that's literally the backdrop where they were standing and undercut any sort of credibility they had. I understand that journalists will always have some sort of bent, and I get that. But there's a difference between a bent and there's a difference between where you're literally just pushing an agenda that you're willing to hide the truth, and even when the truth comes out, you don't want to go back and correct the record.
Okay.
And say, you know what, I was wrong in my reporting.
Okay.
Or here's the facts.
You mentioned CNN. What about Fox News having to pay almost $1 billion for the election coverage?
That's fair too. I think Fox has certainly aligned itself with the President Trump and his administration. And during the 2020 election cycle, what happened with the elections and the results there, Fox had to go back and certainly pay for claims that were made on air by hosts. I mean, listen, I'm not saying that that Fox News is is better than CNN. Well, maybe they might be, but at least you're hearing a little bit more of the opposite side than you do on some of the other traditional networks, and that's a disservice to the customer.
But you know what? We're not engaging in whether one is better than the other. We're engaging in whether they support parties over facts and truth. And when they know the truth, they don't report it, and they end up paying a price for it, especially losing the trust of the American people.
Well, here, for example, a lot of conservative news outlets will not always cover when there's a contentious police interaction with a person of color. Now, I'm fine with seeing it. I see it on my social media feed. I want to see that reported on Fox and Newsmax, just like I see it reported on CNN. The question is then, how is that? What is the narrative that is shaped around that? Is it about police brutality of all Black people, as though every single interaction police have with Black people is going to end up with a Black person losing their life? The data actually doesn't support that. Or is it that you have an interaction and maybe there's fault on both sides? Let's let the body cam footage actually make a determination. I do fault the media in choosing what stories they cover, not just how they cover stories, but what stories they cover and what stories they don't.
So let me stop you again, because you've said something else. Well, then, this is the question. Can a journalist have strong political beliefs and still fairly report facts that undermine those beliefs?
Yes, you can. Because you're actually, when you look at the sources that are in a particular article, I mean, I'll go back to the headlines and how they're presented, but look at the sources. Are you at least having two different points of view presented in the sources, whether to support or to undercut whatever the article, the news article of the day is? If you can't at least provide two that are competing, then I'm going to question whether you are running a press release from, that someone sent you, or whether you've actually done some journalism. Then there's the headlines, and headlines are very much about clickbait, because very often we know that people's attention spans on social media is 2 seconds to 3 seconds for scrolling. So you have these very salacious headlines that sometimes when it comes to conservative policy makers or elected officials will always mention their politics, but when it comes to a Democrat or a leftist, never mentions their political affiliation, which is very biased within itself. But at least treat the same the same. If you have two members of Congress, both of whom are being investigated for fraud or investigated for corruption and bribery, put their affiliation, both of them should have the same affiliation in their headline: Republican congressman, Democrat congressman. Then you start to actually regain some credibility. So having multiple sources, that is, I think, what we need to get to.
So let me inject something else here. Are newsrooms intellectually diverse enough? We discuss racial and gender diversity constantly, but what about ideological, religious, geographic, and socioeconomic diversity? Because that's the heart of what you're talking about.
Well, let's go to journalism school. Are the journalists ideologically identified as liberal and very far left, or at least liberal or conservative? And you can guess that the proportions are very unbalanced there, where a lot of journalists self-identify as liberal, even if they don't necessarily wear the D affiliation next to their name. If journalism schools, though, are putting out at least balanced or proportional numbers of conservative-leaning and liberal-leaning students, journalists, who at the end of the day, they realize that the bottom line is ensuring that they are pursuing the truth and the facts, no matter where they lead and no matter what it does to the narrative that they would like to support, then you actually have some journalists that are not activists, but are real journalists and truth seekers. What we do have, though, Armstrong, and you know this well, is that we have the citizen journalists. We have the independent journalists who have flourished over the past few years, in particular because of the pandemic. Suddenly, people were not trusting the traditional news outlets anyway. They were finding that it's the citizen journalists and the independent journalists who have blogs, who have Substacks, who are actually doing the investigations, who are actually going after the stories, not just the same 5 headlines that ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, Newsmax, they tend to cover a lot of the same stories. So it's the independent journalists that go after everything else and uncover the new hot topics.
Let me interject again. What stories are journalists missing because too many national reporters live, work, socialize, and think within the same cultural circles?
The fraud epidemic across this country. I think it was first really brought to light with the video exposés by a young man, 21-year-old young man, who just went up to a daycare center and looked at what the records for the state had about how much money goes to that, federal money goes to that daycare center. Are there children there? Asked questions with a video camera. And that is the kind of stories, the rampant, rampantness of fraud across of our states and federal government. I think we all understand that there's fraud, but the magnitude of that fraud to the hundreds of billions of dollars, that is money that either belongs in our bank accounts, or frankly could be going to someone who actually deserves it. Those are stories, though, that have been buried. CBS News has started to pick up the rampantness of fraud across a lot of different states, and we're seeing some of those exposés and investigations too. I haven't seen a lot coming out of CNN. I haven't seen a lot, coming out of MS Now, because I think that there is a willfulness to turn a blind eye to some issues and some problems.
Is it coming out of the conservative outlets?
Say that again.
You said MSN Now. You said CNN. Do you see it coming out of the conservative outlets?
Yes, certainly conservative
Okay.
outlets will choose not to cover every story as well. And that does a disservice to conservative audiences. So, and listen, I am a regular guest on lots of different outlets, including conservative outlets. I always tell people though, I read CNN's headlines. I go to Washington Post. I go to Fox News. I go to Newsmax every day, if not at least every other day, because I do understand that that is how you cobble together a better understanding of what's going on in the world and in the United States. And then I listen to my local news broadcast because I also want to know what's going on in my own backyard. And that is how we can be good consumers of the media and the product that they're producing. But unfortunately, we're never going to get everything in one place, and we're never going to get the same spin. And so I do believe that somewhere in between is the truth.
And we'll be back. Welcome back, and we're joined by attorney Robert Patillo now. So Robert, take immigration, crime, race, gender, vaccines, and the economy. Why does merely choosing certain facts sometimes get a journalist labeled as liberal or conservative?
Well, I think it's a question of focus. I'll give you an example. This week, we've had the entire D.C. press corps obsessed over President Trump changing airplanes. Meanwhile, there was an earthquake in Colombia that was a 7.2 magnitude that killed hundreds of people that you haven't heard a peep about. We will focus in on everything that happens between, let's say, Israel and Lebanon, or Israel and Gaza, for example, but there'll be a full-blown genocide going on in Sudan, or wars going on throughout Africa. So the question becomes not whether or not the journalists are reporting things that are true, but where is the focus? What are the things you are looking at? Earlier, you were talking about the issue of fraud, which I think is a humongous issue, but I think the biggest driver of fraud that we have to start talking about is military procurement. The fact that that at this point in time, if you look at some of these defense contracts that are going out, and the fact that the Pentagon is asking for another $1.2 trillion per year for bloated programs, for $2 billion bombers that you can't fly in the rain. If you look at the NASA budget, Elon Musk has a $5.2 billion contract to land people on the moon in 2023. The rocket hasn't made it to outer space yet. So when we're talking about the journalistic slant, you can paint any group in any direction by your focus, but I think we have to have a broad-based system where we're actually reporting facts as have been said, but also putting the information out there for the public to decide. We have a lot more punditry than journalism today, and that's the reason we have so many people going to outside sources. There is no objective truth.
Mr. ONWUKA, he makes a very interesting point on punditry, but should journalism distinguish more clearly between reporting, analysis, commentary, and activism? Have those lines become dangerously blurred?
Well, they absolutely have, which is why the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is looking at television shows like The View to consider whether or not their designation as a news program is actually true. Do they both bring on a proportional, if not give an equal amount of time to conservative and liberal policymakers? I think we can all agree they don't. But The View is just one example of that. And it is interesting when you have television shows, particularly in cable news, but across local news and national outlets, whether the news story is actually hard news, just reporting on what's happening, versus a discussion and commentary. So, for example, we are having commentary here, and we're doing punditry because we're providing our own analysis of what we're seeing. But journalists don't always express whether what they're writing is their own opinion and punditry, commentary, or whether it is actually just the facts being reported on the ground. I'm glad to be on with Robert. It's good to be on with you, Robert, and I agree with him that, we actually, when you consider how much foreign news is not covered, the fact that I just discovered right now, Taiwan is ramping up their military exercises because they expect China could make a military move at any day now. That should be alarming to all of us. Why? Because Taiwan is an important trading partner, and for the region, stabilizing that region. But unfortunately, a lot of the headlines are on, the press secretary leaving. I think that's important. I really like her. She's fantastic. But there needs to be a broader coverage on a lot of different news. And I understand that sometimes it's where the clicks go that the news outlets tend to follow with the stories.
You know, Mr. Patillo, social media rewards outrage and speed.
Yes.
Journalism requires context and verification. Can serious journalism survive an economic model that rewards the opposite?
Well, this is why we had things such as public broadcasting in the past. This is why you had a non-for-profit media apparatus. Your medicine is not supposed to taste like candy. News is not supposed to be fun and entertaining. It is news. But once we got into this for-profit model, that meant that we can no longer cover the zoning thing that's going down at City Hall that's going to affect roads in 10 years. Why cover that when there was a fight at a high school or something that's going to get actual more attention? We've moved so far away from actually having news. I think most people couldn't recognize news if they saw it. I encourage people to watch foreign news outlets where they still have to just deliver the news directly to you. Things like DW News out of Germany, France 24, BBC, other international networks, and you'll see the stark difference between them just telling you what happened today on Earth versus American news, where there's graphics, there's punditry, there's a guy at a big board, there's left and right, all those things. And because of that system, we don't reward anyone who actually knows what they're talking about in America. All of us have been on cable news. They stick you in front of a camera. You get 30 seconds to make a point about something very important, and then after that they shuffle you off, and afterwards you're in the green room and you find out the person you were debating actually has no idea anything about the topic. They just read it 5 minutes before they got there. That's the way news is made in this country, and this is why we have such uninformed populace, and that's what the real tragedy of all this is. There are people who want information and have no idea where to get it.
You know, Mr. Patillo raised about the latest controversy in Turkey and the threat by the Iranians. I want to raise a different question. You know, this is a question that I would ask the president that I've been actually curious about. If the threat against Air Force One was credible enough to secretly remove him from the aircraft, why weren't the people who remain aboard warned that their plane might be a target and they could be obliterated in airspace? And I say this because I saw him in Butler, Pennsylvania, when he raised his hand, how he showed America who he was. So your thoughts on that, Mr. ONWUKA? You know,
he's the president of the United States, and he is going to be privy. He might not have even known right away why the plane was changed or whatever the case was. I don't expect, and I don't think anybody who's aboard that plane should expect to get the same amount of information at the same time. But you do know that if you're working with the president's press
I'm going to interrupt you because I know where you're going. So I'm going to ask you a different question because I know exactly where you're going. I'm going to stay with you. So does protecting, then, the commander-in-chief morally justify allowing your cabinet officials, staff, military personnel, and journalists to fly aboard an aircraft being used as a decoy?
If necessary, he is the president of the United States, and he is the leader of not just this country but the world. And so, if you need to do that, I think there's an expectation.
Even if they die,
there's an expectation of protection. Certainly,
I understand
not
that.
the same level of protection that the president gets.
I understand that, but they all should be sacrificial lambs.
I would not want anyone to be a sacrificial lamb, but I think that you have to assume some risks of being alongside a president who's had 4 attempts on his life on U.S. soil.
So if you were aboard that aircraft, you would be willing to die based on what you're saying?
I don't work for the president.
No, I'm saying if you were on board. If you were on board, I'm asking you a different question. If you were on board.
But Armstrong, if
Patrice,
you work for the
I'm asking you a
president
different
and you're
question.
with the president who has suffered so many, been the target of so many
I'm asking a different question now.
You would be willing that there's going to be a risk.
You would be willing to give up your life and not go back home to your boys?
I'm not in that position, so I don't have to make that decision. But I'm just saying.
Okay. I'm going to move on. We ask very difficult questions today. I like it when our guests have to think these things through. I love it. This is what it should be about. We should challenge ourselves. So, Mr. Patillo, what responsibility do journalists have to correct misinformation when the misinformation benefits their own political, ideological side?
Well, I think this goes back to the fourth estate. This goes back to the fundamentals of the concept of being a journalist and somebody providing news. You cannot allow your personal opinions to color the news. You have entirely too much power in your hands to shape public opinion for your own personal ideas, your own personal views to shape what you're reporting. Same way the doctors have an oath, the same way the lawyers have an oath. Journalists need to have similar oaths. And once you find yourself falling away from that, that's when it's time to no longer call yourself a journalist and call yourself a pundit. This happened on ESPN a couple days ago when Michael Wilbon said that Stephen A. Smith essentially was not a journalist anymore because he's not covering news stories, he's not writing articles, he just responds to what other people say and do as a pundit. And there's nothing wrong with punditry, there's nothing wrong with opinion, there's nothing wrong with editorializing, but there needs to be a very clear line between what Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow were doing and what Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow do on a nightly basis.
You know, Mr. ONWUKA, are journalists sufficiently skeptical of government regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats control it?
No, they're not. And especially when you look at a lot of the articles that are written, if it looks just like the press release that was sent out from the federal agency, then that tells me that you haven't done your job. I mean, certainly you can copy a little bit. This agency head said X, Y, and Z. But if you're not actually going out and speaking to both the people who are being impacted, also the people who are academics, research experts who have put some time into understanding deeply what an issue is before reporting, then it makes it hard for you to do something other than just copying a press release from government. And it happens in different administrations. You know, I do think that, you've got an administration here. It's a conservative administration, and conservative outlets do challenge the president and his administration from time to time. Could I say that the same of the Biden administration with journalists there? No, I couldn't. And I think when we see now the text messages, the books that have come out, Jake Tapper at CNN, for example, talking about just how the back channels that they had with administration officials, the information that they knew with Dr. Fauci's and text messages to, again, Jake Tapper, it really makes us wonder, just where these people who call themselves journalists and run evening television news programs, just how closely they are aligned with ensuring that the narrative from a particular administration gets out there. And you know what? The administration has no desire not to have that kind of close relationship because they want to make sure that their message gets out there. But it is incumbent, as Robert said, for journalists to put aside their narrative and their views to actually report. And that means not just going to the typical sources or one-sided sources, which we often see.
What is one thing, Mr. Patillo, American journalists could change tomorrow that would begin rebuilding this public trust?
We have to get rid of the revolving door between the media and policy. You're either covering the subject or you are the subject. So imagine, for example, if somebody was like a cable news host and then became Secretary of Defense. You would probably say, wow, that seems like that might not be the right relationship between somebody who's supposed to cover the government and then be part of it. Imagine if like a news pundit became, I don't know, U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia or something along those lines. And now you're expecting them to have non-biased legal opinions at the same time where they're supposed to actually be talking about that in the public. We have to get rid of that revolving door, because when people can't see the difference between the journalist and the people the journalist is supposed to be covering, because they are literally the exact same people, it becomes impossible to thereafter believe they're going to be non-biased and forthcoming about these things.
So my last point is to Ms. ONWUKA. What advice would you give to the U.S. Attorney Jean Perino?
Well, she's a bright woman, and before she was on television, she certainly served the public as a public servant, actually putting dangerous criminals behind bars. So, right now I understand she's trying to present, dealing with the fact that, the reflecting pool has had some issues, and she's had to drop charges against those that we thought may have been sabotaging the pool, and maybe it was really more just a contractor issue. But I think she's smart enough to understand that, at the end of the day, if crime is going down, and if she's able to prosecute truly dangerous people from society, then that's really what she can stake her job on. For people who are ABC news hosts who have left previous Democratic administrations, to Robert's point, we've seen that on the left side too. Let's not just talk about people leaving Fox and going into the Trump administration. It happened with the Clinton administration, and now and the Biden administration as well, and the Obama administration, and many people who are in media.
Look at George Stephanopoulos.
But to that point,
please.
It happens, and so you know what? Can they be objective? I don't know, but that said, it's going to continue to happen, and I don't think that's unlikely to change anytime soon.
And let me just say this, because I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Let me tell you the advice I would give to the U.S. Attorney Perino. You must always uphold the rule of the law. You must always deal with the facts, not the emotions of the case. And you must follow where the evidence leads you. And if the evidence leads you that that person that was accused did not commit a crime, that person should be set free, even if it costs you your job. And we'll be back. And welcome back to the broadcast. There's my man, Tyler O'Neill, managing editor of the Daily Signal. He also carries my syndicated column by Creative Syndicate, and I appreciate that. But, Tyler, why has the transgender sports debate become so difficult for journalists to cover without immediately being accused of taking a political side?
Yeah, this is a very difficult issue to cover because it involves major issues of worldview regarding what it means to be male and female, what it means to be human. So what you have here, you have a very loud activist class that demands that everyone kowtow to the transgender claim that anyone can switch sexes by, if you're a man, claiming to be a woman or vice versa. And usually in sports, the issue is men claiming to be women. And the rest of, what I would say is the rest of us who can see biological sex with our own two eyes, who can say, no, just because you identify as the sex opposite your own, that doesn't mean you are really, in any sense, the opposite sex. So if you're a man and you want to compete against women in women's sports, you should not be able to do that because you're still a man. And it doesn't matter what you want to go by. It doesn't matter if you start undergoing these experimental interventions to make you appear female. You're still actually male.
So let me stop you there. Yeah. Then what should be, Tyler, the starting point for reporting this issue? Biological sex, gender identity, competitive fairness, civil rights, or all the above?
Yeah, I think they all intersect. And I think what's important here is that those of us who disagree with transgender identity, with transgender ideology, we don't say that we want to mock or belittle or otherwise demean people who identify as the sex, as the gender opposite their sex. I think this is a real mental health issue. And I think that oftentimes, from what I've heard from the experts in this, that many of these identities trace back to other forms of trauma that need to be addressed psychologically. And so when we're talking about this issue, I think it's all of the above. It's very important that we say clearly, look, men's spaces are for men, women's spaces are for women, but we do understand that there are people who really do suffer from psychological issues here. The answer is not to force society to accept a false narrative. The answer is to encourage them to undergo, mainstream talk therapy that's going to resolve the issues underlying their gender confusion.
But does accurate journalism, Tyler, require reporters to acknowledge biological differences between males and females, as you're talking about now, even when doing so creates this political controversy?
Yes, I would say 100%. I think journalists have, in this current environment, journalists have a duty to get the story right. So when we're talking about women's sports, for instance, and you're talking about somebody who is male, who identifies as a woman and is competing, the fact that that person is biologically male is very important to the story and needs to be mentioned by a reporter. Now, of course, you can if you want. I mean, I think that even using transgender pronouns for someone is shirking a journalist's duty to tell the truth. But I think it's very important also that journalists take into account what the person presents themselves as. So oftentimes the way that you get around this is you avoid using pronouns altogether. But I think the journalist's first duty is to always tell the truth.
But at the same time, how do journalists cover transgender athletes as human beings rather than reducing them to these political symbols?
I don't think it's a reduction. I mean, I think it's important for us to look at people as people and for journalists to report the truth. When it comes to these situations, the fact that Leah Thomas is male is a fact that journalists need to include in their reporting. But when Leah Thomas speaks about his experiences in competing, it's very fair to quote those experiences. It's very fair to quote Leah Thomas saying that he is uncomfortable with people criticizing his participation in women's sports. Like, there are ways that you can do this. Leah Thomas is a competitor. He is male, but at the same time, he is a human being. And it is the job of a journalist to tell as much of the story as possible in the constraints of telling the story and keeping the audience well informed.
Are female athletes sometimes reluctant to speak candidly because they fear being labeled hateful or intolerant? And if so, should journalists be doing more to create spaces for those voices?
Yes. I mean, I think absolutely we've heard over and over again that female athletes are nervous about speaking out. Thankfully, we have many female athletes who've started to speak out publicly and have said, no, I am not comfortable racing against biological men. I am not comfortable with them in my locker rooms. And I think it's important for journalists to tell both sides of the story. And one of the things that has driven me up a wall is when I see the Associated Press, Reuters, these other wire services that cover the issue from a very biased pro-transgender perspective. And I understand if you want to say in your reporting that some pro-transgender groups claim certain things about the need for societal acceptance, that's fine for you to include in a report. But when that's the only thing you're saying, and you're not saying, look, there are downstream effects. Many critics say that this transgender inclusion will silence people, will lead to unfairness, will put women in harm's way. Those aspects of the story need to be told as well. And the fact that we have a system that is really systematically prevented that side of the narrative from being featured in straight news content is a shame and a shameful mark on journalism in general.
Is this something unique only to the United States?
No. I mean, I do think the United States in some ways is worse than other countries, but we've seen this issue pop up across the world. And it's important also to note that many countries, such as Britain, Scandinavian countries, have started to really reverse the steps of the transgender movement. They've started to say, look, we're not going to put minors on these experimental drugs that make them look like the opposite sex, and that many studies have shown are linked to many negative ramifications down the road. And so when it comes to the women's sports issue, that also is popping up across the world. The United States tends to generate the most media coverage. But what we've seen is the activist groups that have influence on this issue are not only interested in the United States, they are interested in other countries. And of course, I feel honor bound to mention that our own taxpayer dollars through USAID were sent across the world to promote this ideology in other countries.
You know what?
So this is not a problem unique to the US.
You know, I'm sitting here listening to our conversation, and it is so strange. These girls practice their lives, make sacrifices, yearning for the day that someday they'll play in the WNBA. They could be another Serena Williams on the tennis court. I remember Serena Williams in an interview a few years ago before she retired, and I know she was on David Letterman actually, and David asked her about playing against the guys. She said, I could play against the guys in the 200 or 300 and they would still beat me. She said, Andy Murray would beat me 6-0, 6-0 in less than 50 minutes. She said, women just cannot compete with men. And I asked myself, why would the W in the WNBA is for women? Title IX, why are we having a discussion where you decide as a man to become a woman, that all of a sudden you can go. Can you imagine if a man hits somebody boxing, another woman, or wrestling? Can you imagine not just the sport impact of it, but the physical impact? Is that why are we even having this debate, which is such common sense, that men should not be playing in women's sports? It's just common sense.
It's very common sense. And I think it's important to note, we have a case in the Pacific Northwest where a female was actually wrestling with a male wrestler who identified as transgender. And in the middle of this wrestling match, the man allegedly violated her on the mat right there. And like this was a sexual act where he grabbed a certain part of her anatomy that I'm not going to mention here, but it's the one you're thinking of.
Was it up top or below?
What?
Was it up top or below what he grabbed?
Below.
Oh, Lord.
He grabbed, and in the middle of this, you see on video the female wrestler shouting for her mother, saying, "Mom, he grabbed my blank."
Man.
And this is a case that's and I don't know what the circumstances really were behind that incident. I don't know if that was intentional, but it certainly seems like it was intentional, and it certainly seems.
Well,
as though,
I see guys wrestling; they grab there all the time. So I don't know. It just maybe I'm not going to say it was intentional. You know, I don't know. This is why they shouldn't be playing in women's sports in the first place.
Exactly.
If that was
it
a woman,
too many questions.
That's why this conversation. Listen, thank you for joining us, Bruce Fein and Jean Marie is coming up next here on the Armstrong Williams Show. It's crazy, isn't it? We'll be back. In this segment, I want to expose one of journalism's biggest blind spots. Africa, which is too often enters American news only through war, famine, coups, disease, or geopolitical competition. So I want to ask my guest, I want to start with Jean-Marie COULBARY, who's president and founder of United World Holdings. Why does a continent of more than 1 billion people receive so little sustained attention from American journalism?
Good morning. It's nice to be on the air. It's really nice to be with you this morning. Yes, I'm looking forward to sharing these different views with you, but I couldn't really hear the question. The sound on my side is very, I could not hear the question very clearly. I don't know why the
Bruce
sound
Fein,
is
why is that? Bruce.
I can hear you, and I heard the question very loud and clear. You know, why is Africa largely treated as the stepchild of the mainstream news media? And I think it's because, in large measure, its impact on American elections, national security issues, are the caboose rather than the locomotive. And that's what the reporters cover. To the extent that there is coverage, it's more likely to be immigrants from Africa, from Somalia, from Nigeria, from South Africa. They have a direct impact on the United States. I don't think the coverage has always been as accurate as it should be. But in some sense, it is a story of the brain drain, if you will, that the immigrants that come here from Africa are by and large very gifted. They're entrepreneurs. In many cases, they're fleeing, if not persecution, arbitrary, capricious government that denies them the fruits of their labor. They come to the United States because at least if they work hard, they know the likelihood is very high that they can be successful. But journalists, they cover things that cover the money and the power. And on that score, compared to the other areas of the world, the Persian Gulf, China, Russia, it's second tier. I don't know how you're going to change that. But I say, if you talk about the most prominent treatment of Africa in our news media, it's the immigrants more than what's happening back home.
So, Jean-Marie, has American media helped create an outdated image of Africa by disproportionately covering conflict, poverty, corruption, and humanitarian crises?
Well, thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me clearly. I think that concerning the other topic we talked about, immigration, I think that immigration is needed all around the board. And you do have very good immigration. It could be students, and it could be business, it could be investments in the U.S. So I think immigration is a good thing all around. Americans going to Africa and Africans coming to America. On concerning the business aspect of more business and more trade between the U.S. and not looking at a second Cold War with Russia or with China concerning trade issues, AGOA is a very good thing. I think most African countries don't take advantage of AGOA. So I think AGOA should be a very key element and should be renewed. And people should push for AGOA to go on. But African countries should be more aggressive on using AGOA in a positive way. I don't think they use it too often, and I don't know, they don't know how to use that. Concerning Russia and China and trade is good for everyone, and it has to be a fair trade agreements. And I think sometimes the Chinese take advantage of Africans because they're in a rush to do a deal. They're not looking for a real interesting, proper deal that will create jobs and opportunity. Concerning the U.S., I think that the U.S. should invest more in Africa, but in processing. We need to process more our minerals, and we need to process more of our products so we can create more jobs in Africa so people don't immigrate to Africa, to the U.S. or to Europe more, because it's only because of jobs and growth that they don't have at home that pushes them to immigrate.
Bruce, I'd like you to respond to what Jean-Marie said. And also, did America leave this wasn't possible through neglect, where China goes in and exploit and take advantage of these African nations?
Well, that's certainly an element here. Part of it is, and it's not an insignificant part, is that we have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that China doesn't have. And anybody who's familiar with Africa knows that China gets its way regularly by corruption. They bribe, they get contracts, they have kickbacks. Oftentimes they bring in their own laborers. They don't even create homegrown jobs. But at the leadership level, you can buy them off. They'll build huge palaces for the head of state, highways or something, glamour projects. And the United States is generally not willing to do that, in part because our laws prohibit that kind of corruption. And so China, at least in that sense, wins the game. I do want to underscore, however, that we need to remember with regard to media coverage, Africa is not in isolation. It's competing against all other places in the world for attention. And so if you had asked somebody, is Africa more important to the United States, even economically, including AGOA, than the Strait of Hormuz being closed, we'll say no, it isn't. I'm not defending that. Just because it doesn't have an enormous immediate economic impact doesn't mean it's not important. But that's how the media, covers issues. You'll get one-day stories like the Moroccan, if you will, 80,000 immigrants going into Ceuta, a territory of Spain, and then you get 3 or 4 days story of it, and then it goes away. It doesn't have sustaining power because Morocco and Ceuta is not continually important to the United States. That's just the way of the world. Journalism follows power and money. And that is everywhere in the world. And if you want to be at the top, you have to be at that rank. The other element I'd observe, and I think it's different depending upon the country, is that the embassies of African companies generally in the United States are almost brain dead. They're not out there like the Israeli embassy is with the advocates for their countries having media interviews and explaining this is what's happening back home in Gaza, the West Bank, or whatever. And to that extent, the ambassadors generally are not very good advocates for their countries. That can be changed simply by appointing people like my colleague here on the show today. He'd be a wonderful advocate, but he's not at that level.
So
yes, thank you. I agree with you. The embassies, first of all, I want to say something. We are badly treated in all the other embassies in Africa, and I would like to share a point with you very quickly. They have us sitting outside, and they don't have waiting rooms for us. And ministries of foreign affairs don't have the will or the vision to take care of us in our own countries. They treat us like cattle in most African countries, where we wait in the sun, we wait for our appointments, we're outdoors sitting under trees. When it rains, we're under the rain. They don't even have the courtesy to make us wait indoors, because they don't plan for us to wait and for visas application. Could be Russia, China, Turkey, France. We're very badly treated in Africa. We never talk about it. And they refuse. They take money from us too. Do not forget, they take money from us. They take $100 to $200. They make billions of dollars on visas that they refuse. They refuse 99% of the visas that are applied in all U.S., French, European Union embassies, and they do not return the funds to us. So they make billions of dollars every year all over Africa, and nobody's talking about that either.
Bruce?
No, I think that's true. It just means you've got to upgrade your game and understand the importance of your own country to having prominence and being understood, because understanding it diminishes the information risk and is going to encourage investment. If you just have an investment in a country you know nothing about, you feel there may be uncertainties there with regard to property rights, legal systems, and otherwise, and you're not going to roll dice with a huge amount of investment. So it's in the interest of these countries to upgrade their standing and their outreach to the media. I think that unfortunately in many countries, there's a very high complacency level at the very top, because they don't confront all of the hazards, the inconveniences that my colleague has simply enumerated here. And that's a question of leadership.
Concerning an object you just said about trade, I think less aid and more trade is what I'm looking at. I think it's going to be nice to have more trade and creating more jobs on the ground in Africa. That's what I think we should do at the moment. And no aid. Aid should be not relevant at the moment.
Yes, but you're only going to get that investment if you have some kind of protection against political instability. And you can rely upon the government to enforce your contracts. Otherwise, it becomes very, very risky. And businesses can invest their dollars anywhere in the world. So it's not like Africa is just competing against itself. It's competing everywhere else. And that's why if their political landscape is very unstable and in upheaval, people say, listen, I'd rather go invest in Slovenia.
So Joan, as we wrap up, do you agree with his assessment?
Yes, absolutely.
No. I'm asking Joan, not you, Bruce. I'm asking Joan Marie. Joan, do you agree with his assessment, if you can hear? Go ahead, Bruce.
No, I was just going to say, I certainly agree with my colleague that what is needed is trade. That's a sustaining economic asset. A gift is just a one-time deal. It's like the Chinese saying that you teach a man to fish, you give him food forever. If you give him a fish, he's got one meal, and then he's got to start looking around for how he's going to get fed the next meal. And trade is the way to go. Giving grants can be good for like startup capital, but it cannot be the enduring strategy.
Listen, I can't thank both of you enough for joining us. Jean Marie, it's good seeing you again. Bruce, it's always a pleasure. Thank you both for joining us on this edition of the Armstrong-Williams Show. I want to thank all of our guests for such a provocative discussion about our focus on the fourth estate, the media today. I'm Armstrong-Williams. Enjoy what remains of your weekend.